Hey.
In 2001, Universal Pictures experimented with a Jurassic Park movie without Steven Spielberg at its head or a direct source to draw from. That movie effectively led to the franchise going dormant for almost 15 years, requiring major star power to resurrect from the dead. But what could have been done to save this threequel, and by extension, the brand? Hi, I'm Brian I, and welcome back to Jurassic Kingdom as we continue to explore the declining quality of the franchise, where each sequel went wrong, and how they could have been fixed. This is How to Fix Jurassic Park 3. So, in my first video, How to Fix the Lost World, link in the description, I implied that further videos would continue to explore the new storyline we created to solve Lost World's issues. After all, the series What If the Star Wars Prequels Were Actually Good was my inspiration for this, and creator Belated Media built his storylines on top of one another to craft a whole new prequel timeline. I struggled to decide if this was the route I wanted to take. In the end, I figured if folks were interested in my retelling of the entire saga, I could do videos in the future that continue that universe. But I thought it was kind of a cop-out to fix further movies by adhering to my vision alone, and would preclude discussions of the problems contained within the realized films. I believe that it would be much more interesting for me to actually work with each movie as it stands within the franchise. That means that in handling each fix, we accept the canon of the films that came before it. So this video will fix the Jurassic Park 3 that we got, and not consider my version of Lost World as a stepping stone. If the idea of doing a Jurassic Park 3 video based on my Lost World Redux script appeals to you, sound off in the comments, and I'll start that as soon as I'm done with this series. Cool? Great. Oh, and once again, if you're unfamiliar with the first three movies in the Jurassic Park trilogy, you're slacking. Go watch them. But if you do need a refresher on Jurassic Park 3, check the link in the description for a recap. Now let's land this plane in a freaking tree. Let's start off with the fact that Jurassic Park 3 lacks the grandeur of its predecessors, where Lost World expanded its cast of characters and roster of dinosaurs, supercharged its action scenes, and upped the stakes by delivering the ill-advised San Diego Rex sequence. Jurassic Park 3 feebly chooses to highlight the size and ferocity of the Spinosaurus and the intelligence of the Velociraptors in lieu of actually going bigger. It's also the shortest Jurassic film, clocking in at a paltry 92 minutes, where its predecessors were over 2 hours in length. The movie suffers from the diminishing returns of how sequels were viewed in the past. Today, films seem to be greenlit based on their ability to create a franchise and tell an overarching story over multiple installments. That wasn't the case before the late 2000s. Sequels were largely considered obvious ploys by the film industry to turn a cheap profit, and that assessment was not exactly off base. Jurassic Park 3 was a prime example of how sequels were given a meager budget compared to the original, and then floated on brand recognition to make it profitable. Storytelling was an afterthought. The idea of building a cohesive story out of the franchise, as with Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, was not even contemplated. Had it been, as I mentioned in my Lost World video, the middle beat would not have included the escape of a dinosaur to the mainland. That would have been saved for the climax of the entire franchise, which would have been Jurassic Park 3. And unlike most franchises these days, the stakes are not raised in Jurassic Park 3. If anything, they're lower than they've ever been, and that makes for an underwhelming entertainment experience. Jurassic Park 3's story revolves around Dr. Grant being suckered into joining a rescue operation looking for Eric Kirby, a young boy who is stranded on the island. And that's it. The story hints at interesting concepts, such as InGen's propensity for secret projects.
Not on InGen's list.
It's because it wasn't on their list, and that makes you wonder what else they were up to.
And the Pteranodon's escape from the aviary. But they never quite evolved the basic premise of the film into something more meaningful, or just more spectacular. Normally, I would be all for intimate, character-driven sequels of big-budget films like Skyfall and Spider-Man 2, but Jurassic Park 3 never reaches its full potential. The condensed nature of the film causes it to feel rushed and makes the movie basically an extended chase through the island. Whereas in Jurassic Park, the Rex appears in a few key scenes, one of which she never directly interacts with the human characters, weaving in and out of the narrative as a wild animal would. The Spinosaurus acts as a stalker, narrow-mindedly following our heroes as they attempt to make it off the island alive. The raptors serve precisely the same role once Billy steals their eggs. The two primary antagonists of the film, the Spino and the Raptors, may have different motivations for doing what they do, but they're basically serving the same function. In the first film, the Raptors stalk, the Rex just wanders around. It highlighted the intelligence of the Raptors and the comparative animalistic instinct of the Tyrannosaur. Here, there is little distinction. Speaking of those raptors leads me to another point of contention I have with this movie, and that is the designs and color palette of some of the film's returning creatures. Strangely, to me at least, the film crafted its new dinosaurs with realistic colors like its predecessors, which I personally appreciate. We all know that dinosaurs could have come in a myriad of colors, and that we just don't know what colors are true to life. But the team behind Jurassic Park knew it would be an uphill battle to convincingly portray dinosaurs to a modern 90s audience. The CGI and animatronics could all be state-of-the-art, but if the Rex burst through the fence in hues of purple, the illusion would likely break, because terrestrial animals of that size in today's world aren't typically brightly colored. Grays, browns, dull greens, that's what people are used to seeing. And if you introduce your animals in candy striping, you strip them of their power, even if that ends up being the reality. So I loved the oak tree-like patterns on the Spinosaurus and the muted tones of the Ankylosaurs. The Pteranodons looked absolutely fantastic too. But the Brachiosaur's new color scheme seemed too cartoonish for the franchise to that point, and the same goes to a lesser extent for the Tyrannosaurus, though I'm willing to forgive it a little if I subscribe to the debunked theory that it's the baby Rex from Lost World and that's just its youthful color. But where things really go off the rails for me are the raptors. In recent years, I've seen a lot of people start to praise the designs of the raptors in Jurassic Park 3, but my opinion on them has not changed one bit since 2001. I still dislike them. I can't be swayed. I can't be persuaded. It's visceral. I might even get a little hate for this, but the Raptors lose a lot of their menace in this movie, even as the narrative is trying to push them as even more cunningly intelligent than they were in the last two films.
They were smart. They were smarter than dolphins or whales. They were smarter than primates.
Simply because their designs err on the side of garishness. These are ambush hunters, and their matriarch is white, a color unlikely to blend in with her environment. The males, or Quilliam, fare slightly better, but those red eyes are awful. My biggest problem is the lack of consistency with the previous movies, with the females in brown with faded black spots and striping, the males with their striping more tiger-like and pronounced. This implies one of two things, and I don't like either one. The first is that the Raptors always look like this to the characters, and the film's retconning their looks simply for the sake of keeping things fresh for the audience. That theory, of course, falls apart when you consider that even if that were so, Grant's nightmare of the raptor on the plane is of a male raptor.
Alan!
And to this point, Grant had only encountered female raptors. And before someone comes into the comments with the theory that one of the three we see is a male, potentially the one Muldoon refers to as the big one, don't forget that the implication of this retcon means that it would have been very easy to tell which were the females and which were the males, as their coloration is very different. And so InGen would have realized right away that their animals were changing gender. And in any case, Jurassic Park 3 shows the raptors to be matriarchal, so a male raptor would likely not have been head of the pack. So, that's definitely not the theory to which I subscribe. The other theory makes more sense, and is the generally accepted canon, and that is that there are at least two different tribes of velociraptor, sharing space on this island, with at least three different tyrannosaurs, a spinosaurus, and at least one ceratosaurus. We can solidly assume, too, that there are Dilophosaurs, and we can further speculate that the island is also home to Carnotaurs, Herrerasaurs, Baryonyx, and more, based on implicit information we get in the movies, or explicit information from tie-in sources. In any event, that's a lot of predators on a smallish island, and two tribes of raptors filling the same ecological niche strains my credulity. I want to stop here and give this movie its due. After all, I liked this film for a long time over its predecessor, The Lost World. There must be something I liked about it, and there are a lot of things that Jurassic Park 3 does better than Lost World. For one, JP3 returns Sam Neill to the role of Alan Grant, who's even more grumpy than he was in Jurassic Park, which in turn provides several comedic and dramatic moments which elevate the material. More than that, however, characters are at the center of this movie, which is a change of pace from Lost World. Grant, Brennan, and the Kirbys all have subplots and arcs, however ham-fisted and cliched as they might be. The Pteranodon attack scene was fantastic. It might be the best action sequence in the entire movie. And best of all, there were no dinosaurs on the mainland, ending tacked on for no thematic reason. In fact, this movie ends kind of how Lost World should have, with a hint that the animals would be making it to Costa Rican shores. It's actually a miracle that this movie even makes any sense, with writers coming and going, delays in production, rewrites given to cast and crew at 11th hours, and an extremely mishandled production. Jurassic Park 3 should be a mess, but it's cohesive, and even if the characters and animals don't do things that make a whole lot of sense, the story sure does. The film itself never gets lost, as Lost World does in the last act. It knows it's building to a final confrontation with both the Spino and the Raptors, and it does just that. For the second time running, though, a Jurassic sequel fails to stick the landing. Where Lost World went too hard, Jurassic Park 3 doesn't go hard enough. In the end, a tense interaction with the Raptors searching for their eggs and the group at their mercy is cut disappointingly short by the arrival of the US military, courtesy of Ellie's husband, Mark. Apparently, there were several endings that were considered before being scrapped, the most exciting of which would have pitted the Raptors against the Spinosaurus. But they were all dropped in favor of the ending we got because of time and budget constraints. It was a disappointing end, not just to the movie, but to the trilogy itself. Even though Jurassic World would revive the franchise, it took 14 years to do so. And the back-to-back disappointments of Lost World and Jurassic Park 3 are very much to blame. And if I could change only one thing about each of these movies, it would be their third acts. But there's a lot more than an ending that can be fixed here. So let's get into how to fix the whole of Jurassic Park 3. Now, unlike my Lost World video where I intended to write a script based on all the ideas I was presenting, since I don't have a script in this one, I'm going to go pretty detailed, almost scene by scene, with how I think Jurassic Park 3 should go. It will be a little dense, but here we go. The idea of a rescue mission isn't a bad one per se, but it should act as a springboard for a more epic story. And so that's what we'll do. The cast of characters can more or less remain the same, but we'll have some major deviations in plot and motivations from the movie the further into our new story we get. It's important to note that I am honoring the kind of stories each of the sequels was trying to tell rather than reworking them completely. So you will find that instead of a wholly new story, I'm just trying to make their stories better. First, let's examine our dramatis persona. Our main character will remain Dr. Alan Grant, with his protege Billy Brennan as essentially the co-lead. Throughout the narrative, Billy will express an ill-advised desire to see a Tyrannosaurus. Paul and Amanda Kirby will now actually be wealthy rather than simply pretending to be. Their son Eric will also be trapped on the island again, but will not be a dinosaur nut, and they're going about trying to rescue him. The three mercenaries they hire, Udesky, Nash, and Cooper, will also be present, though they will be fleshed out further, so they aren't just throwaway dino fodder. So far, it seems like I'm not changing much of anything, but I want to keep the bones of the delivered film to throw enough meat on it to steer the story into something more memorable and effective. Our opening scene doesn't have to change very much at all. We can still have Eric Kirby soaring the skies with Ben Hildebrand above Isla Sorna with an illegally run parasailing business. One big change I would make is the appearance of the fog. One enduring mystery in the JP community is the identity of the boat's attacker. Since we never see them, with ideas ranging from the pteranodons, which wouldn't make sense because their escape from the aviary is later seen as a result of the human characters scrambling to get out themselves, to a never-mentioned tylosaur, which frankly would only work if it had been introduced before or since. The dinosaur most of us, including myself, have settled on is the Spinosaurus, since the boat seems to be passing the delta of a river when the fog starts creeping in. Even though it's a little silly to imagine the Spino would swim out that far just to nom on two dudes, let's say it was just curious and went out to say hello and found them by happy snacksident. The presence of the fog is meant to obscure the audience view of what is happening. A blatant cop-out, if you ask me, and used way more effectively later on in the aviary. But it also prevents Eric and Ben from seeing anything too, which I think is a missed opportunity to give Eric the chance of being a more three-dimensional character. Instead of never seeing the Spino at all, I propose instead we get hints of it like we did the raptor in Jurassic Park's opening scene. The crest of the sail, the tail disappearing beneath the waves, its roar. But you know who does see it in its full glory? Eric. And Ben, the poor doomed lemon. We can even hold on Eric's horrified reaction as he watches. We don't. The Spinosaurus consume Enrique and his friend on the boat. Then the boat crashes, stranding Ben and Eric, just as in the final film. In this fashion, we have our introduction to the primary dinosaur antagonist of the movie, and we set Eric up to have a more personal connection with the Spinosaurus, a nemesis, if you will. Now, this doesn't matter for the opening scene, but there'll be more to Ben Hildebrand, so don't forget he exists just yet. From there, we can introduce Grant and Billy in much the same fashion as the movie, but I would also like to introduce a subplot involving Tim Murphy. Despite the better character work in this movie than in Lost World, one thing this movie gets wrong is completely undoing Grant's growth in Jurassic Park. Grant, after all, risked his life again and again to usher Tim and Lex to safety, and found that kids aren't so bad after all, leading the audience to believe that, by the end credits, Grant's opinion on having children with Ellie had changed. In the film we got, not only did they never have children together, but they're not even together. Further adding insult to injury, no mention of the children he did once care for is made. The kids appearing in Lost World seems, in fact, out of place, since they spent very little time with Malcolm and barely interacted with him at all. I'm getting a little off topic here, but I want to make something abundantly clear. Tim and Lex Murphy, and by extension their actors, Joseph Mazzello and Ariana Richards, have been shafted by this franchise. They were the youngest of the child characters to endure an island full of dinosaurs, and they have a personal connection with the company and the man responsible for all of this. Where the hell did they go? You mean to tell me they just, forgot all about this and moved on with their lives? This won't be the last time I revisit the concept of Lex and Tim returning to the franchise, because the Jurassic World trilogy truly missed the mark by leaving them out of the proceedings. But for now, Tim doesn't need to be physically present. We just need a way for Grant to grow. In the movie, Grant's experience at Jurassic Park cooled his passion for dinosaurs.
I read both of your books. I like the first one more. Before you were on the island. You liked dinosaurs back then.
Well, back then they hadn't tried to eat me yet.
By film's end, however, Grant is reminded of why he fell in love with dinosaurs in the first place, through Billy's childlike enthusiasm and tenacity, and by the majesty of the creatures themselves. I really liked Grant's conversation with Eric on the boat, and I think we should use that sentiment to explain a slightly modified arc for Grant. In our story, Billy will serve as a spiritual stand-in for Tim, who we find out in dialogue has decided not to pursue the sciences as Grant has guided him to do, but follow in his grandfather's footsteps into the world of business. Grant will brush past this and hardly acknowledge it, focusing instead on the world's burgeoning indifference towards paleontology in light of the San Diego incident. Grant is still with Ellie, but she works now in a university lab, and so they often spend months without seeing each other. We can actually keep the entire scene in the hall, then cut to a conversation between Alan and Ellie over the phone, in which Grant laments how little money he's been able to raise to fund his digs, and how the world is moving on from paleontology in light of the miracle of cloning. This is where we learn about Tim's choice, when Ellie gingerly brings up how he's feeling about it. Grant brushes it off, saying something along the lines of, Tim's a smart kid, he can make his own choices. We are then introduced to the cast of mercenaries led by Udesky. In the finished film, Udesky describes himself as more of a booking agent than an actual mercenary, but in our story, he is in fact a gun for hire, with his companions being Nash and Cooper. We learn in this scene, which similarly takes place in an airplane graveyard, that a Mr. Kirby has engaged their services for some unspecified job. Udesky says, "Where a go, just as expected. One job for the price of two. It's going to be a walk in the park." We then cut to Grant's dig site in Fort Peck Lake, and we are introduced to Billy Brennan, who instead of flirting is actively running the place, directing deliveries, handling a disagreement, and adjusting someone's technique in fossil removal. Much like in the movie, Billy has rented a machine to sculpt a velociraptor's resonating chamber, which he shows off to Grant. They are interrupted by Mr. Paul Kirby, who asks for a meeting. I would remove the hint that Billy and Paul had previously met, as well as the moment where Billy goes over Grant's head to accept the invite. Instead, Paul will simply be a more suave and convincing presence and insist more firmly on a dinner, for good reason, as we already know. Grant eventually, reluctantly, acquiesces. Instead of a dive bar, Grant and Billy are brought to a nearby hotel Paul and Amanda are staying at, which features luxury accommodations and a formal restaurant. Sidebar, there doesn't appear to be anything like this in Fort Peck, Montana, where Grant's dig site is, but it's a fictional universe, so I created one. Suck it, reality. I want Grant to feel out of place, uncomfortable with money, as he was uncomfortable around the technology of Isla Nublar in the first movie. During the course of this dinner, Paul and Amanda present Grant and Billy with the same deal. For an excessive fee, Grant could provide context, narration, and information about the dinosaurs to Paul and Amanda, plus a few guests of theirs, as they flew low and slow over the island in a chartered airplane. The scene would only require a few changes in dialogue, reintroducing Paul as an adventurous hedge fund manager and Amanda as the CEO of a Forbes 500 company, and removing the suspicious mentions of their supposed outdoor accomplishments. Grant at first refuses, noting that 3 years' worth of digs wasn't worth the horror he endured at Jurassic Park. Paul points out that this was strictly an aerial venture and he would fund 5 dig seasons. Amanda, at Grant's reluctant look, will then offer to sweeten the deal, using her clout to promote paleontology, real paleontology, by influencing local schools to send field trips of children to dig sites to learn about the dinosaurs. Now we're off to the races. We get the plane ride over the Pacific, the introductions to the undercover mercenaries, who Grant theorizes quietly are more probably bodyguards. And I want to point out that there is no dream sequence with a talking raptor, because Grant never actually falls asleep. They see the herds on the plane, and Grant gets his line.
I got it, forgotten.
He and Billy are restrained when they protest landing, and it is demonstrated to them that the mercenaries are armed. Paul insists that there is no danger, and there is reason for doing this. The plane lands, we hear the Spino roar, and Billy eagerly asks if it's the T-Rex. Grant says no. I hate the line that we get in the film because it implies Grant somehow forgot what a Rex sounded like. And then the Spinosaurus attacks. This time, however, all 3 mercenaries survive and regroup at the plane. The pilot begins to accelerate down the runway. Through the windshield of the jittering airplane, the audience can see the shape of the Spinosaurus burst from the tree line and onto the runway. The Spinosaurus assaults the fuselage, but everyone survives except our new pilot. They escape while the Spinosaurus is busy destroying what's left of the plane. In our story, it will be highly territorial, and this aggressive behavior is its sole motivator. Once they are far enough away, the stranded companions catch their breath, assess the situation. Udesky, Nash, and Cooper insist they have to stay in the area, as much of their equipment is still on the plane. The few armaments and supplies they do have won't be enough for everyone to survive the island and complete their secret mission. Paul and Grant reluctantly agree, but Grant notes that they'll have to wait for the dinosaur to move on, and that in the meantime, they can explain exactly what the hell is going on. Paul and Amanda come clean. They are not together anymore, but their son Eric had disappeared, along with Amanda's boyfriend, during an illegal parasailing excursion to the island. Paul reintroduces Udesky, Nash, and Cooper as mercenaries skilled in jungle warfare, who he'd hired to protect them and find Eric. Grant, furious, asks why they dragged him into it, further upset by the fact that they let him bring Billy too. Udesky explains that while this is a jungle, and they were trained for jungle warfare, it is a jungle filled with animals with which the mercenaries had zero experience. Grant was an expert, and they required someone who could identify which animals were threats and how to avoid them. Billy convinces Grant to stay with the group after the elder paleontologist threatens to go his own way. Cooper says that the mission is still viable. With the mercenaries' resources and the Kirby's money, they'd had access to the top-secret report detailing the events of the Lost World, and therefore knew where to go to call for help, as well as all geographical information handed over to the authorities by InGen, including the location of several structures. They could find shelter at the closest one of these structures, the lab, try to locate Eric, and then be extracted by one of Udesky's shady contacts. There is a majesty scene with passing ankylosaurs, akin to the Brachiosaurus and Stegosaurus scenes in the previous films. Billy mentions how impressive the Rex must be. Then Nash, Cooper, and Grant return to the plane for supplies, in which they are moderately successful, and during which Grant catches pockets of suspicious chatter between the mercenaries, but also learns of their motivation. Cooper needs money for his wife's medical condition, and Nash wants to raise his mother out of poverty. Meanwhile, Udesky, the Kirbys, and Billy stay put. The Kirbys get into a squabble, highlighting the differences in their personalities that led to their separation. Paul is losing his composure, traumatized by the events that just transpired. Amanda, perhaps more familiar with the high levels of stress due to her job as the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, attempts to settle his nerves, though she appears just as shaken. She snaps that this was just like him, to break down at the slightest inconvenience and make her put her own feelings to the side to handle his. He shoots back that she sees it as managing him rather than comforting him, and that was the root of every single issue they had. This spirals until Amanda walks off, Udesky following. Paul has a brief conversation with Billy where Paul expresses his guilt that he allowed Grant to bring Billy along at all, hinting at the father-son relationship they seem to share, and wondering out loud what this hypocrisy said about him. Just as Nash, Cooper, and Grant are returning from the plane, a pair of ceratosaurs splinter the group again, this time Billy with Udesky and Amanda, and Paul joining the scavenging party. Both groups successfully evade the ceratosaurs with no casualties, but are still separated. Individually, they decide if the other group was still alive, they would head for the lab to continue the mission. On the way to the lab, we have some more character development between Paul and Grant. Paul apologizes to Grant about their situation, but Grant is in no mood for forgiveness, growling about kidnapping charges. Paul stops and says there wasn't anything he wouldn't do for Eric, and asks if it was Grant's kid in danger, would he not put it all on the line? Grant says nothing, and Paul presses on. He says that he knows about Grant's actions at Jurassic Park, risking his own life to save children he didn't even know from certain death. Imagine what he would do then to save someone he cared for and loved. What parts of his soul would he give up to accomplish that goal? With the trio of the other group, Billy reveals that, unlike Grant, he knew how to use the internet and had done his research about Amanda's business, and discovered that her company's most profitable asset was a biotech firm. He insinuates it's mighty convenient that she of all people would lose a child on an island housing the most lucrative animals in the world. This is when they stumble onto the parasail Ben and Eric were using at the beginning of the story. One of the scenes that most bugged me in Jurassic Park 3 is the fact that the group just stumble onto a completely unguarded raptor nest and are not only able to escape, but also have time to call over Grant to examine it. So we are dropping that scene entirely for a new one that serves the same purpose. Billy will finish examining the area around the parasail looking for clues, while Udesky and Amanda are off doing the same. He notices the off-white shell of an animal egg. It looks distinctly familiar to the audience, an exact clone of the one we saw in the lab in Jurassic Park. Billy, unfortunately, does not recognize it. He searches around a little, but finds no nest. The camera lingers on him, staring at the egg. Then we cut back to him joining Udesky and Amanda, and the trio setting off for the lab, more convinced than ever that Eric and Ben were nearby. For the record, Billy totally took the egg, and let's just chalk this one up to a careless animal that attempted to steal an egg and failed, leaving the egg by itself far enough away from the nest for Billy to safely find it. The groups rejoin at the lab. Billy quietly shares his suspicions with Grant, but they are interrupted by the sound of raptors nearby. They quickly go inside. Inside the building, Amanda attempts to use the phone, but it's dead. Nash explains that likely they would need to restore the geothermal power to the lab via a junction box. They are able to find one at the end of a series of hallways with offices. Udesky and Nash leave the group with Cooper, who works to get the power back, ostensibly to set up a perimeter and watch for raptors. In reality, they are going to Henry Wu's old office and computer, which Udesky had spotted on the way in. Cooper gets the power back on. While Udesky is furiously clacking away at the now working computer, trying to clone the contents to a portable hard drive, Paul reveals he'd heard what Billy had told Grant about Amanda's involvement in Eric and Ben's disappearances. As things heat up, a window shatters in the last room of the hallway. From the dark shadows emerges a male velociraptor. To be clear, it's a male as we see in The Lost World, not the abominations Joe Johnston conceived for the final film. And let's just say for the sake of continuity that following the rescue of the survivors in TLW, The raptors no longer felt the workers' village was safe and moved their territory closer to the lab. There, continuity fixed, and there don't have to be multiple tribes of raptors existing in a small ecosystem. Cooper opens fire, beating the raptor back, but then he foolishly decides to pursue killing the animal and is subsequently killed himself. Grant will watch as his firearm discharges randomly in the dark room the raptor emerged from, silhouetting several raptors, tearing him apart. They flee the scene, running into Nash and Udesky, who is stuffing something, the external hard drive, into his pack. Together, they rush to the main lab, where they hide among the incubators. The raptors follow, and we get a tense scene of the raptors stalking the humans through the lab. The raptors find Amanda, and just as they are about to strike, they are all rescued by a sudden burst in a cloud of tear gas, which frightens the raptors away. It's the missing kid, Eric, and he ushers the humans out of the fumes and down another hallway. They go out a side door and down a covered walkway to a small structure outside the lab. It's a storage shed. There are no windows, and the door is strong. Once inside, the Kirbys have an emotional reunion with Eric, and Nash and Udesky mourn the loss of their friend and wonder what to tell Mrs. Cooper. Eric will then explain that he's been hiding here since the accident and that Ben had brought him here. During Eric's explanation, we get flashbacks and hints that Ben was more than what he seemed. Ben, in fact, seemed to know what he was looking for and what he was doing. They had only been there a couple of days when Ben said he was going to try and restore the power but never returned. Eric had been surviving since, on rations they had scavenged from the lab. Billy asks what Ben had to do with everything. Paul doesn't understand, but Amanda seems to. Udesky interjects and says that night is falling soon and that they all needed to rest. While the group starts to settle, Udesky sidles over to Billy and quietly tells him to drop it, or else. Billy is also now cognizant of what he's carrying in his own pack, a raptor egg. The next morning dawns, and Billy and Nash volunteer to scout the lab and search for communication. They return and tell the group that all the phones in the lab can only dial internally. None of them can reach the mainland. Udesky consults a map of the island and finds the closest possible location of an outside line is a coastal dock with a dockmaster's office. They could follow a river through an unlabeled and incomplete structure, but which would also take them through Spinosaurus territory. They would first have to get past raptors. The group leaves the safety of the shed. It doesn't take long before they are running from the raptors again. Just as in the film, they will run into a herd of parasaurs to escape. Billy will lose his pack, Grant will pick it up, and they manage to get down a steep embankment to a river where they catch their breath. They will find a barge-like vessel as they do in the film. As Udesky and Nash try to get it going, Billy and Grant have a similar interaction as they did in the film, where it is revealed what Billy took and why he wants to take the pack back from Grant. This time, Grant does not highlight the parallels between Billy's actions and InGen's, but rather Billy's actions and the mysterious actions taking place by members of their own group. Billy hits back in this version, his frustration with Grant's seeming indifference to the plot boiling to the surface, and reminds Grant that he himself is only here for the money too, and Billy was just following that example. He also adds that he's not Tim, and to stop expecting him to abandon Grant too. We then have a scene where Grant almost leaves the egg behind before changing his mind, realizing they will be safer carrying it as far as they can. Following this blow-up, Nash and Udesky are able to get the boat going and they head down the river. Billy, feeling guilty, sulks away from Grant. Paul and Amanda also get a short moment where Paul says she has a lot to answer for when they're safe. They arrive at the gates of what they soon discover is the aviary. They are able to pry it open and allow the boat entry. Inside, we get the foggy atmosphere, and after a few minutes of tension, we have a pteranodon attack sequence. Nash and Udesky fire their weapons from the boat, while Amanda and Eric huddle together at the center console where Paul is driving the boat. Grant and Billy will disembark to open the gate further down the river, using the trees on the bank as cover. The scene ends with Billy seemingly sacrificing himself by leading the pteranodons away as Grant finishes unlocking the gate to free the boat. Grant is able to clamber aboard and the aviary fades into the distance. As it does, Grant sucker punches Udesky. He demands the full story, the entire scope of what is happening. It's cost at least 4 people's lives at this point. Paul agrees. Instead of Udesky or Nash, it is Amanda who answers. She reveals that after a few months of dating, Ben had told her about someone he knew selling InGen secrets, which began a plan to gather data and intel on everything to do with Isla Sorna. They came across the information that had helped them this far. Maps, instructions about the geothermal power systems, and even accounting that indicated the hard drive of Dr. Wu had been left behind. With the contents of the hard drive, Amanda's biotech company would be unbeatable. Under the guise of a parasailing trip, Ben was meant to videotape as much as he could of the airfield to make sure that they could land there. The company sits in this revelation for a while, Paul and Eric disgusted and hurt, and Grant expressing his sarcastic hope that all of this carnage was worth it. Then it starts to rain. This is where we begin our Spinosaurus attack. Instead of the dinosaur sinking the boat, however, we get a stalking scene which culminates in Nash being killed as he's dragged under the water by the Spino, drowned, and then consumed. During this commotion, Eric freezes up, the Spinosaurus' appearance triggering all the built-up trauma he'd suffered since the initial incident, causing some panic on Amanda's part as she attempts to get him away from the dinosaur. Udesky intentionally dumps some of the gas into the river as the Spino approaches from the rear, then Grant fires a flare gun, causing the oil to ignite and scare off the Spinosaurus. Grant and Udesky have a heart-to-heart moment where they mourn the losses of their friends, and Udesky apologizes for his inability to keep everyone safe so far. They make it out of Spinosaurus territory and past the plains they'd seen earlier from the air, the rain a drizzle with the herbivores grazing majestically. Grant has a talk with Eric, which culminates in the astronaut-astronomer sentiment that plays out in the movie. Now we move into the climax. The boat reaches the dock as night is falling. They are able to make the call for help, and the rescuers indicate that they need to meet at a landing site down the beach at a landing spot in the morning. The group settles in with Udesky on watch. Amanda, still being shunned by her ex-husband and son, makes appeals to them, apologizing for her scheming and allowing herself to be taken in by Ben's promises of making her biotech firm the most powerful in the world. Paul is not impressed, but Eric seems to ease up a bit, though he remains firmly by Paul's side. Grant sits through the whole scene staring into the middle distance. The raptors attack here at night. The dockmaster's office was not as fortified as the lab shed, and the raptors are managing to break through. Udesky is shooting at the windows sporadically. Grant is holding the door. Paul is holding Amanda and Eric in the corner. Grant says they have to show the egg, and Amanda grabs Billy's pack and, showing her willingness to protect her family, sticks it out the window. The raptors now cease their attack and back up, allowing Amanda, with Grant next to her, to exit the dockmaster's office. We have a scene similar to the one in the movie where the female, which is nearly identical to the raptors from Isla Nublar here, approaches Amanda and takes the egg. As she departs, the males assume attack stances. After a few moments of resigned horror, a raptor call from the jungle is audibly heard, and the male raptors seem at first confused. Then they too depart. Grant muses the female must have called them off. A moment later, Billy appears from the jungle, battered and clothes torn, limping heavily. He had used the printed raptor resonating chamber to simulate the female's call. After a touching reunion between him and Grant, they bring him into the dockmaster's office, and Udesky tends to his wounds. The morning dawns, and the group set off down the beach. They don't make it far when a loud crash frightens them. They turn to see the Spinosaurus destroying the barge with extreme prejudice. In the process, the dockmaster's office is also leveled. Its roar echoes throughout the area. The group begins to run down the beach, which catches the dinosaur's attention. It gives chase, loudly bellowing at them as it does. Paul trips. Eric stops in his tracks and turns around, again frozen, watching the Spinosaurus bear down on his prone father. But then he runs back, helps Paul up again. The Spinosaurus is closing in, roaring and snapping. Then there is an answering roar that slows the Spinosaurus, which looks in the direction of the sound. Grant turns to Billy and says, "You wanted one? You got one." A Tyrannosaurus lumbers onto the beach from the jungle in front of them. It is a duller green than the one we see in the finished film, and there are old scars on its left leg. This is the young Tyrannosaur from the Lost World, almost fully grown. The humans are all now caught between the two apex predators. Udesky brandishes his rifle but doesn't yet fire. Billy points out the speck of a helicopter approaching from the sea. The dinosaurs charge each other. I'll note here that the reason that this is happening is that the Spinosaurus left its territory to destroy what it perceived was a threat to itself, the barge. It is now in the young Tyrannosaurus territory, and the Rex is defending it. The humans break for the rock jetty down the beach from the fight. I'm not going into the particulars of this fight, but the two will slam each other into trees and sand, eventually crashing into the water. The Rex disappears under the surface for a moment as the humans are climbing over the jetty, and the Spinosaurus makes an attempt at them. But the Rex reemerges and continues the brawl. At some point, a weak Billy is in danger of a fall into the waters around the fight, and Udesky helps him back up. He loses his footing, and the Rex is able to snatch him up in its jaws, killing him and destroying the hard drive as it slams into the Spino. The survivors make it to the far side of the jetty as the helicopter makes its descent. The Rex roars as the Spino swims away out to sea. The helicopter lands on a wide patch of beach as the group hurries to catch up. They see the wake of the Spino approaching as they clamber aboard and scream for the pilot to take off. The Rex also charges the chopper from the beach. The chopper successfully manages to achieve lift away from the dinosaurs as the two titans get close. The two continue to battle for dominance as the chopper turns to Costa Rica. The Kirbys huddle together, brought together by the trauma of their experience. As Billy is being tended to by the medic aboard the helicopter, Grant fusses over him and asks if there's anything he needs. Billy says all he wants is for Grant to make a call when they get back, a call to his other protege. He insists that he can't let the past lie. There was simply too much he could miss. And that's it. My vision of a revamped Jurassic Park 3, focusing on characters while also ratcheting up the dinosaur action. It's by no means perfect, but it's what I would have personally liked to see. As I've mentioned in this series before, the key to making a sequel to such a beloved IP isn't to lose the character in the spectacle, and it isn't to lose the spectacle to mediocre character work. It's to find a balance between the two that serves to emphasize both, feeding off of one another to create a satisfying, memorable experience for the audience. Jurassic Park 3 could have revitalized the franchise in 2001 if Universal Pictures had the foresight to actually believe in their property. But it's so very clear that they were simply trying to wring a little bit more cash out from the audience before they'd exhausted the goodwill the first film had brought them way back in 1993, and that they did not care to make a quality film. All of the insane, outlandish, science fiction-y ideas that they had conceived for the future of the franchise were exactly what the movies needed to make money, as the Jurassic World films proved. But in 20 years, pop culture will still be celebrating Jurassic Park and barely acknowledge any of the sequels at all, because none of them matched that first one, or even came close to doing so. What are some of the things you wanted to see out of Jurassic Park 3? Let me know down in the comments, and stay tuned for more Jurassic content coming your way. Subscribe to the channel so you'll be the first to know when I've posted a new video. I'll be tackling the first Jurassic World soon, so stick around for that. Like, share, and rip this apart down below. I'm Brian I. This is Jurassic Kingdom. Later, nerds.